no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
WILL is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. This is Pat Garrett, Communications Director here at WILL, and we're excited to bring you back for another episode that blends contemporary political issues and constitutional conservative thought. And so we're back today to talk about redistricting, and it's really no surprise in light of a new SCOTUS ruling on the Voting Rights Act and the continued efforts by red states and blue states to maximize their political parties' representation in Congress. We're here to talk about the short-term and long-term consequences, and there will be many. I'm here with WILL President Rick Esenberg, back as our co-host. He's the founder and president of WILL, and he's going to walk us through the Supreme Court decision. And also joining us is former state representative and election data expert Joe Handrick. Joe's a great friend of WILL. He was on the show for our first episode of season 2, and we're excited to get back into it. So I want to just get into this first question right now. So Rick, I want to start with the SCOTUS decision. Give us a summary of what SCOTUS said and how it's going to play out in a redistricting conversation in, let's say, Wisconsin.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of misinformation about this decision. This decision didn't gut the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act still exists. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act still exists, and it prohibits governments from using various tools to discriminate on the basis of race in voting. What the case addressed is an interpretation, a judicial interpretation of Section 2, which for a long time essentially said that under certain circumstances, there was an obligation to draw races, to draw districts that would benefit certain excluded minorities. It tended to be either Black voters or Hispanic voters. And the circumstances under which there was an obligation to do this was a 4-part test. If you're a lawyer, you understand that 4-part tests and judicial balances lead to very, very indeterminate results. And the test that the court was employing, without getting into it, basically enacted a loose requirement of proportionality. The act wasn't supposed to do that. It explicitly says that it wasn't supposed to do that, but that's what happened. And we saw that most clearly in the Wisconsin Supreme Court's decision in the first redistricting case this cycle, in the Johnson case, that was summarily reversed and remanded by the Supreme Court of the United States back a couple of years ago. And so what the court said in Calais is that you don't do that anymore, right? It is unlawful to discriminate on the basis of race in drawing district lines, but if you can identify a substantial inference of intentional discrimination. But absent that, there is not a violation of Section 2, and in fact, it does violate Section 2 in the Constitution to intentionally draw districts to benefit the voters of one race. And so what happened in Calais is the Supreme Court moved from what was essentially an affirmative action interpretation of Section 2 to a non-discrimination interpretation of Section 2. So still unlawful to discriminate on the basis of race in drawing district lines, but that means no drawing of district lines on the basis of race. And that is what the court held.
I want to ask this question to Joe. It's the reaction from the left to this decision was something along the lines of, now all of this Republican, led redistricting efforts are going to take place in the Deep South and kind of wipe away African-American representation. There's a lot to unpack here as far as what political party is going to benefit from this in the long run. And so, Joe, I figured if you could weigh in on that first, and we'll go from there.
Well, I have seen a number of Democrats claim that this is just going to create more Republican seats in the South. But that's not necessarily the case. It often will be the case, but not necessarily. Let's take Virginia, for example, where not that long ago, an African American woman ran for governor as a Republican, but the state chose a white liberal woman instead. And that governor, who's now governor, supported, advocated, and helped pass a new redistricting map, which creates a partisan gerrymander in favor of Democrats. And part of the key to them doing that was they actually eliminated a majority African American district. So it goes both ways. In Wisconsin, in the South, this decision will, I think, ultimately lead to a net addition of Republican seats. But in Wisconsin, I think it could have a very different effect. In the South, in order to draw majority minority districts, they oftentimes had to do so artificially. They had to go out of their way and intentionally gerrymander to cobble together pockets of minority voters that did not necessarily live in the same community in order to create these districts. That's racial gerrymandering. But in Wisconsin, it's very different. The African American population in Milwaukee is highly concentrated, highly compact on the north side of Milwaukee. And if you were to ask a computer to draw equally populated compact districts, it would draw a number of majority minority districts in Milwaukee. And in fact, to not draw a number of majority African American districts, you would actually have to intentionally split up that community and gerrymander to avoid creating majority African American districts. And I'm afraid that in Wisconsin, this decision, if Democrats were given power, could lead to that outcome. And the reason I believe that is because we've seen this movie before. In the 1970s and 1980s Democratic maps, they actually drew them in a way to artificially create too few Black majority districts in order to take that Black population, those Black voters, and spread them out over multitudes of Assembly and Senate districts in order to create more Democratic districts. So the answer to your question sort of depends on where you are, and you can have very, very different outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I just thought was so fascinating is I think, you look at a state like Illinois, a state like Wisconsin, and there is a lot of different ways that you can cut up a district, and it's going to create, I think this will benefit Democrats, honestly. Like I look at I think, will you see 4 or 5 less Democrat legislators or Congress folks represent the Deep South? Yeah, I mean, possibly, potentially. But could you see that get made up in Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois alone? Yeah, I think even more so. Like I think the Democrats this will be a net winner for them at the end of the day.
I think you have to understand what had happened with the partisan use of the Voting Rights Act in more recent years. Early on, when there was an assumption that Black voter turnout would be very small relative to white turnout, the idea was that to create a majority Black district in this affirmative action way that I just explained, you had to pack minority voters into a single district in order to create a supermajority. That if you wanted Black voters to be able to elect the candidate of their choice, you'd have to draw a district that was 60, 65, 75% Black because the turnout of those voters would be lower. What we've seen in the post-Obama era is Black turnout rates have increased. And so what you would increasingly see is not packing Black voters into a single district, which actually, packing Black voters, Democratic voters into a single district would be a classic form of Republican gerrymander. And so there was kind of this alliance between Republicans who wanted to pack Democratic voters and people who were advancing the claims of minority voters under the Voting Rights Act. Well, now, because Black turnout is higher, they made the argument that, well, what we can do is we can spread these Black voters out more. And we might not get Black candidates elected in these new districts that we're going to create with a higher percentage of Black voters, but not a supermajority. But we will elect Democrats. And that is exactly what the Democrats tried to do in the initial redistricting after the 2020 census in Crawford. They created a bunch of districts. Yes, they were black majority districts, but not super majority districts by any stretch of the imagination. They were 51, 52%. Some black politicians objected to that in the Johnson case. They said that, look, that this will elect Democrats, but it's not going to elect black candidates. So I think that Joe is exactly right, particularly when you consider the interplay of Calais with Rousseau. There are circumstances under which what happened last week will benefit Democrats, not necessarily black candidates, but Democrats.
Because once you see like like I want to use this Wisconsin example, like we're going to see a congressional candidate from Whitefish Bay or Fox Point potentially. We'll see a congressional candidate, or more legislative candidates as well. Like we're going to see the suburbs, I think, which is now the base of Democrats' operations. Like their voice is going to, I think, be louder. The suburban, the suburban white suburb Democrat voice will probably increase substantially.
And one of the fascinating things after this decision was you've seen a lot of Democrats claiming that African Americans will no longer be able to be elected to Congress. And they've made that claim about Milwaukee. But let's think about this for a second. All of these districts we're talking about on the north side of Milwaukee are safe Democratic districts. In other words, the winner of the district is chosen in the Democratic primary. And yet they're arguing that if a district does not have a supermajority black population, a black candidate cannot win that primary. In other words, what they're saying is that white liberal voters in Milwaukee will not vote for black candidates and are in fact racist. It's actually a condemnation of many of their own voters, the belief that their own voters will not vote for minority candidates, and that therefore you need these supermajority black districts in order to elect black candidates. Because in these districts, the Republicans really don't even factor in, because again, the winner is chosen in the Democratic primary. So I find that whole line of argument to be very revealing of some of the underlying racism that exists within the Democratic voter base.
Do you think, just in general, and Rick, obviously, if you want to respond to that after I ask this question too, I think the trend we're seeing in redistricting, and this case is only going to, this court case is only going to, elevate that, is less competitive districts. We're going to see far more, safe Democrat districts and safe Republican districts in red states too. Obviously, we just talked about, the Deep South example, but what does that mean for the country? Because I have some thoughts as well on that.
I don't know. It kind of depends upon how the parties react to this. If you look at some of this midterm redistricting that's going on, it might turn out to be an example of the old adage that, pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered. Because, in order to make as many Democratic districts as they did in Virginia, or if you look at what the Republicans did in Texas, you have to spread your voters out a little bit more. And as a result of that, you reduce the partisan tilt in a number of districts. And what you hope can happen is that if you have a bunch of districts that are partisan tilted towards your party, Democrats in Virginia, Republicans in Texas, by maybe 52, 53%, that you'll be able to hold those voters, and you'll be able to to hang on, and you'll have, a higher percentage of your party being elected to the legislature, the Congress. But if the political winds shift a little bit, the change can be very dramatic, because these districts have become at least more potentially competitive than they were before. So I don't know what's going to happen. I think the thing that this does do is, and that you have to understand if you're trying to assess what Calais will lead to, is the interaction between Calais and another Supreme Court decision called Rousseau. And Rousseau is a decision a couple of years ago, which considered whether courts can hear claims of partisan gerrymandering. That is it unconstitutional for a state to engage in a partisan gerrymander? And for about 50 years, the court said, yes, potentially it is, but a majority was unable to come up with a test for what a partisan gerrymandering is. So in the Russo case, the court finally gave up on that. And they said, look, we don't have any way, there's no judicially discernible standard that will permit us to identify a partisan gerrymander. And so we're getting out of the business altogether. It's not that partisan gerrymanders are good. It's that there really is no judicial remedy for them because we can't tell what they are. What Calais does is it says, look, we decided Russo, and so legislators are, for better or worse, going to be able to take into account their partisan interest. And you don't get to get around that by redressing your partisan gerrymandering case as a racial gerrymandering case. Now, it might sound at first blush that that's that the ability to make a racial gerrymandering case to get at partisan gerrymandering was a good thing. But in practice, it was really a tool that was available only to Democrats. And because of the high percentage of minority voters who vote for Democratic candidates. And so what Calais did was really bring a measure of fairness into a system in which, because of Russo, parties are going to have a greater ability to, when they have a trifecta, when they have control, to draw district lines that advance to the greatest extent possible their partisan interests.
How I look at this is, and a couple episodes ago, we talked about kind of the quality of members of Congress and kind of what's happening in Washington in general, and how, there's a whole element of Congress not doing their job. There's, we had Congressman Ribble on talking about how solutions just don't happen anymore. And so if we have people who don't have to worry about reelection consistently governing, it's going to incentivize people to be far more partisan and far more political. If we had more districts, I would say like Brian Stiles' district, where it's a Trump +4, he does very well. It's same thing with Paul Ryan. It was not a very Republican district, but it was a very Paul Ryan district. If we have less and less of those in Congress, I mean, what's going to happen to the country? I just think that's going to, it's just going to have negative long-term consequences.
Just at least a small qualification is I think part of the reason this happens is because that's what the voters want, right? We live in a very polarized time, and there's this kind of squishy 10% of the voters that are in the middle, but then there's the 90% who are either strong Democrats or strong Republicans, and they want partisan warriors, right? They don't want someone who will compromise to get things done. And as long as voters feel that way, that's what we're going to get. But if there is a time, and in politics, everything swings back and forth. If there's a time in which voters wake up and say, look, we want Congress to get something done. We want the state legislature to get something done. We don't want partisan extremists in office anymore. We want people that will do something for us, that'll compromise. And and so we're going to be looking for a different kind of candidate rather than, the ones who, seem to do well now. I mean, there's an interplay of that with, primaries. Primaries tend to, favor people who are extreme partisans, but you never know. The voters could be in a different place at some point in the future, and maybe we'll have different outcomes. But for now, Pat, I think you're right.
Joe, I'd be curious what your thoughts as far as you were a legislator at one point as well. It was a different time, right? And talk about what the dynamics are now.
Well, I can remember I wouldn't change positions after a primary. I would be consistent, but I would change my focus after the primary was over to advertising and themes that were more appealing to independent voters and even soft Democrats. And if a candidate does that now, the base says, well, you're a rhino. Or if you're a Democratic candidate and you start appealing to the middle, they don't even recognize that you're simply trying to appeal to a mass audience. The two bases expect their incumbents and their candidates to appeal to the extreme base all the time at every turn. So elected officials like me would really struggle in today's environment. Rick's comment about Texas and Virginia, I think is absolutely right, though. There are a number of analysts who have suggested that particularly Texas may have spread their Republican voters out too thin in trying to gain additional seats. They may have put more seats at risk. And if there's a blue wave election, it could actually end up backfiring. And the same holds true, except, of course, the opposite in Virginia. But at the same time, that means that theoretically there's more districts then that are competitive, which, to your point, Pat, I think that is healthy. But one thing that I haven't seen too many people talking about that I find interesting with this mid-decade redistricting and this run to make your state all one way or all the other is we're almost recreating the Electoral College. So now not only will the winner of the state get all the electoral votes, but whichever party is in control of the state will also get almost all of the congressional districts. And so it's funny when you see a state like Virginia doing it, because Democratic voters don't like the Electoral College, but yet in Virginia, they essentially just replicated it.
No, that's a really good point. I think that's like, and obviously what we're going to see is massive population changes in the 2030 census benefit red states, with Florida and Texas continuing to gain population. And then obviously Midwestern states, the ones that, especially that lean a little more blue, especially Illinois, right, is going to lose seats. But I do want to, I don't know if you guys have seen these maps on X, where it's a map of Illinois. It only nets them a couple more seats because Illinois is already just so slanted in how their maps are drawn. But it's basically Chicago pinwheels out and covers the entire state. Those are now far more permissible under the new Supreme Court ruling. Do you guys think that that's a real map that could come into play?
I think that there's a political constraint and potentially a legal constraint. The political constraint is there could be, if something is too extreme and too obviously unfair, a backlash on the part of the voters. And that backlash is likely to, it obviously can't be, it's unlikely to be expressed in legislative races if they're gerrymandered in an extreme way, but can be expressed in statewide elections. And we haven't really seen that. Process arguments are always very, very difficult with the voters. They care about what they're paying for milk and that gas and that type of thing. But there could be a situation in which we see that, or you see a constitutional amendment proposed that would, establish a commission or something like that. The second thing is that the state constitution might impose limits on that. Now, here in Wisconsin, I don't think that the Constitution can be fairly interpreted to say anything about partisan gerrymandering, but there is a constitutional requirements of contiguous districts, compact districts, districts that, spokes radiating out of Chicago are not particularly compact. There is a admonition to avoid crossing municipal boundaries as much as you can. You can't in today's world completely respect them, because you wouldn't be able to get districts of equal population if you did that. But there are potentially legal constraints. But Joe is right. I think that there is a great deal of leeway for partisan gerrymandering right now, and if politicians believe that the voters will tolerate it, then politicians will do that. This may, to some people, suggest that we ought to revisit the decision in Russo, or we try to get some type of constitutional amendment that deals with partisan gerrymandering. My only concern is that most of the definitions of partisan gerrymandering are highly problematic. Typically you have people talking about the comparison of statewide partisan elections. In Wisconsin, race for governor is usually 52-48, and so that means the legislature should be 52-48. But in a state where the Constitution calls for single-member geographic districts that are contiguous and compact, there's no reason to think that the outcome of 99 legislative races will match the outcome of the statewide race. And so, if you define partisan gerrymandering in that way, you're essentially undercutting the single-member geographic districts that are contiguous and compact that our Constitution establishes.
The pushback on that is like the alternative then is to just let Virginia keep happening, let Texas keep happening. And then what, I mean, then we're going to just have like a very polarized country. We're going to only have, like someone, alluded to, we're only going to have, Republicans from Texas. We're only going to have Democrats from New York. There won't be any sort of, I would say, like ideological diversity in from states and like in Congress. I just think it's going to become, and honestly, I think one of the concerns people have is this is awfully familiar to division in the country that led to a civil war, right? Like when we just have one set of ideology governing one state versus the other, like the country could potentially split in two, could it not?
Rick touched on what I think one of the problems of trying to legislatively ban partisan gerrymandering, and we saw this in Wisconsin. And Rick and I appeared at a WisPolitics panel a couple of years ago where I actually predicted this would happen, which is Democrats will say, well, we don't want partisan gerrymandering, but then they will define gerrymandering to not include their gerrymandering. They'll call it equity or they'll call it fairness. And they even brought in experts in the last redistricting case who disregarded compactness, but yet made up an entirely new unconstitutional standard of equity and fair distribution based on the statewide vote, as Rick was talking about. So when you can't get both sides to agree what partisan gerrymandering is, it's very, very hard to ban it.
I mean, I've told this story before, I think, on this podcast, but I'll tell it again because it's a good one. In the most recent redistricting that took place in the Crawford case, it became apparent that the court was going to do something with the maps. We were aware here at Will that one of the arguments that had been made to identify partisan gerrymandering for years was to say that a map was an outlier and to prove that by doing this complicated computer simulation called an ensemble analysis. And what you do is you say, okay, draw a contiguous and compact map. You tell the computer to draw contiguous and compact maps that respect municipal boundaries to the extent possible while keeping them equal in population. And you draw 25,000 maps, and then you see where a proposed map falls on the resulting distribution, right? Is it right in the middle? Does it look like most of the other maps, or is it on one of the tails or even outside the bell curve altogether? And so what we did in that case, with the help of some experts, is we did an ensemble analysis. And I said, look, do this ensemble analysis and don't take into account the partisan lean. Don't turn that part of the computer program on. Just do it, and let's come up with the perfect modal map that falls right in the middle of that bell curve. And we did that, and we accomplished that. We had what one of the expert witnesses in the case called the modal map. And what happened with the court-appointed expert and the Democrat-affiliated parties in the litigation, they attacked that. They said, well, no, because that doesn't give us statewide proportionality, which, as I explained before, is not the proper measure of a partisan gerrymandering. So, this is an area where there's not a lot of principle consistency, right? Politicians politic, and they try to do the best that they can. And, I think in response to that, it is going to require a democratic response. It's going to require voters to say, look, we don't want this anymore. So we'll have, a truly nonpartisan commission with truly neutral criteria. We'll insist that politicians do something like that. And we'll express that in statewide elections, for governor. The other thing that always bothers me about these partisan gerrymandering claims is that they assume that being a Democrat or a Republican is a mutable characteristic, that, you are either one or the other and you can never change, just like you can't change your race or, frankly, gender. That's not the case with partisan affiliation. And so, part of the problem that we have in these partisan gerrymandering cases is both the Democrats and the Republicans say, We want to win, and we don't want to change who we are. We don't want to change the position that we take. So Democrats want to, elect a statewide legislature based on making an appeal to people in Milwaukee and Madison. Republicans want to elect a statewide legislature without making an appeal to people in Milwaukee and Madison. And perhaps one way to crack this gerrymandering solution is for the parties to come to the conclusion that maybe that's not what we should do. It's not historically, it's not what they've always been. Even within my lifetime when I was growing up, there used to be an array of ideological predispositions in the Republican and the Democratic Party. They were not unified on every issue. And I think that was, in fact, a healthier time because it promoted deliberative democracy. And sometimes, in order to do something that had to be done, it forced compromise.
I totally agree. I think, and again, as someone who's done extensive political campaign work, candidate quality, and I call it a candidate quality deficit in a campaign. If you have one candidate who is just far more, whether it's through experience or message or likability or just, certain connections to the community, if you have a candidate with better quality, they can and will overperform the political generic ballot or generic party performance in any district, any state. It's why we, to this day have Republican governor. We had, Larry Hogan, a governor of Maryland, is a Republican. The Iowa governor's race is really competitive right now. You have a Democrat who could win in a state that Trump won by 13. That's all attributed to candidate quality, right? And so I think if we just I think the point, Rick, you might be making is, if we went back to looking at why don't candidates for office just get people of all political stripes to like them, this problem could resolve itself.
Yeah, or at least more people than the base, right? I mean, you have a situation now where, Donald Trump has, except for a brief period of time around the 2024 election, generally has horrible approval ratings, right? Most of the country doesn't really like him, but yet he got elected 2 out of 3 times. And part of that is because of the partisan divide, right? There's a lot of people that will feel that they have to hold their nose because, while they might trend towards being a Republican or trend towards being a Democrat, when they don't like the candidate their party has put forward, it nevertheless is very difficult for them to cross party lines because the other party makes absolutely no attempt to appeal to someone with the views or the circumstances that they have. Every appeal is to the base.
I'm thinking back, Pat, to 1994. On the same day, Tommy Thompson and Herb Kohl, one a Republican, one a Democrat, each won something like 68 or 69 Wisconsin counties. And so what that does at the legislative level, it puts a lot more legislative districts in play because so many more legislative districts prove that they could go either way. So it all goes back to Rick's point he made earlier, which is to a great degree, voters have chosen this system of extreme because voters now are not swinging the way that they used to. They're much more likely to just be hard D or hard R.
Yeah, ticket splitting is basically completely collapsed for the most part. And obviously it still exists in small forms. I think 2018 was probably the latest example in Wisconsin of some actual ticket splitting where, Governor Walker had a very small defeat to Tony Evers. I think it was less than a percentage point, but then obviously Leah Vukmir lost by double digits, I think, if I have that correct. And so it's, obviously Tammy Baldwin did far better than Tony Evers. And there's reasons for that. Right. And so, but now with it is in a base appeal and the primaries, I think what's happened too is primaries have become far uglier than they have in the past. I think that's creating candidates who are more extreme when they win in the general election. And that's sending a more extreme candidate to Congress on both sides. I think and look what's happening in I think the U.S. Senate, right? There's all these conversations. People are well, we need AOC to primary Chuck Schumer. I would even say too, look at how some of these Senate primaries are going. You could look at Texas, where Ken Paxton is probably going to beat John Cornyn. And then also up in Minnesota, you have a very left-leaning candidate who's going to beat the establishment candidate for Congress. And then the main Senate race as well, where the sitting governor, Janet Mills, had to get out of the primary. And she was the like DC-backed recruited candidate. She had to get out of the primary in favor of someone who's far more, I would argue, playing to the base.
Yeah, and let's look right here in Wisconsin, where the owner of the Minocqua Brewing Company is going to run for governor because he claims Francesca Hong and Mandela Barnes are not left enough. I mean, that leaves me speechless.
It's totally wild. I agree.
What's the over and under on the votes he gets though? Like 100?
Well, like with most things with him, this is all marketing to sell beer. But he does have an enormous fundraising potential. He has a network across the country of people that support his super PAC and things. So I wouldn't be surprised if he raises a lot of money and attracts very few voters.
In closing out our kind of conversation on redistricting, and we have a history segment I want to get to. One of the biggest problems with redistricting right now in this entire battle and what's going to create more is just more distrust in our institutions and just less overall, I think, a functionality of government. Is there even a Band-Aid solution on redistricting that could be enacted, or is there something else that could be done to maybe help correct this problem? And I'm just going to kick that to you guys and let me know what you guys think.
Well, like with most controversial issues, if there was an easy solution, somebody would have done it already. So I scratched my head trying to figure out how you unwind, because Virginia says, well, we just did it because Texas did. And Texas says, well, we did it because Illinois did it at the start of the session. And Illinois says, well, we did it because Wisconsin, even though it didn't gerrymander, it had an unfair result. All these square districts result in unproportionality. And I'm not sure how you get at it, except Rick pointed to an open door before, which is that if states have constitutional provisions that require compactness and try to avoid splitting municipalities and things like that, that will act as a self-check. But we look at Virginia, they have language in, I don't know if it's their law or their constitution, that says that referendum questions must be neutrally worded and cannot use arguments made by either side. But yet they did. So
can you read that amendment question for people who may not know what we're talking
about? The amendment question said, shall the Virginia House of Delegates be permitted to draw a new map to restore fairness in elections? I read that. I read that.
It's like I wrote it.
I honestly thought it was a joke. I read it the day of that election. I said, this has to be a joke, right? You can't ask a question this way. But they did, even though it was illegal. And that if the Virginia map ends up being tossed out, that could be the reason why. So that's yet to be seen. But so we have to, maybe the answer is, and Rick talked about this a little bit, is not only having, but enforcing your constitutional safeguards. And compactness is a big one. But again, in Wisconsin, a couple of years ago, those experts came in, Bernie Groffman was one of them, and he just disregarded compactness and said, no, what we need is proportionality. Even though I've read the Constitution many times, I can't find that metric anywhere in there as a requirement for maps, because it's not.
But you will find compactness in there. Sean Trendy, who is one of the experts in that case for the legislature, I just saw a recent post he said at X, and he, hard to get it passed, but I think what you need to do is, if you want to place some limits on the ability to partisan gerrymander, you have to have a bunch of neutral and very specific criteria. You can't say be fair or be equitable, because that basically tells people nothing. Everybody has a different idea of what is fair or what is equitable. And it becomes then an occasion to turn the courts, who would be applying these concepts, or legislatures into the courts into partisan actors. And so I think what he suggests is, it's going to have to be stuff like there are various scores to measure, compactness or contiguity. You have to draw districts in which all of the districts that you draw are within a certain range for these scores. Something very prosaic and definite, almost mathematical like that. Now, that won't completely eliminate, gerrymandering because clever people can find a way to maximize their partisan gerrymandering within those constraints. But it will definitely draw a fence around it and will hopefully prevent the type of very extreme thing that we've been seeing with, in particular, with some of this midterm redistricting.
I do agree that, any sort of like compactness or municipality kind of parameters really do help, because you're no longer just looking at voting results in precincts, right? Like Iowa's infamous nonpartisan redistricting system doesn't allow counties split up in a congressional district, right? And so it's like, if you're not splitting up counties, it's a lot harder to redistrict. And obviously Iowa's a more rural state that wouldn't necessarily just work everywhere. But in a state like that, that's why it works. I think you can't take out Cedar Rapids out of Lynn County, right? And so therefore the county itself has to be entirely moved into a district. I think that creates, Iowa right now has pretty much 3 relatively competitive congressional districts and 1 very red one. But, for a state that's a Trump plus 14, I think it's relatively reasonable. And of course, it's just a very rural state. So it's, as we talk about with Wisconsin, the geography benefits the Republicans even more so in a state like Iowa.
In Wisconsin, where Governor Evers proposed the constitutional amendment to ban partisan gerrymandering, I've actually would hope the Republicans would consider doing that, but you have to put in, as Rick said, those very specific limitations. Talk about equal population, and it means less than 1% deviation, and maintain municipal and county boundaries, except as needed to achieve that population requirement, and must be compact, but then define what compactness is and put parameters on it. I actually think the Republicans should consider doing that and putting it before the voters.
Rick, what do you think about that?
That would be a good idea. The problem is that we live in a time now where, both parties have basically become Alinskyite. Saul Alinsky was a political activist and theorist on the left who basically said, forget all this principled stuff, forget all this neutrality, forget all this rule of law stuff, just do whatever it takes to win, baby. And that's not what he said. That's Al Davis who said that, but former owner and coach of the Raiders. But we live in a time where, the principal ethos is do it to them before they do it to us.
What JD Vance says right now.
Yeah, I think there will come a time when voters grow tired of that. And I think we may be getting there. And when we get there, I think that Joe's suggestion would be a great idea for the Republicans, because I think there's going to come a time when whichever one of the 2 political parties does the best job of convincing voters that they no longer think that being, nasty and crude is the way to do politics, that party that convinces the voters that they're willing to be normies, I think is going to benefit tremendously. Whether we're there in 2026, I don't know, probably not. I don't know about 2028, but I think the time will eventually come, because, again, in politics, nothing stays the same.
Joe, you were with us for our first episode on redistricting. We had a little closing segment that was a little different. So now we just kind of dive a little bit more into history. And so we have this phrase, if the phrase that if those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So I hope you came prepared with a prediction. Rick's had to do about 7 of these by now, so he's just on a roll. So I'll let you go first, and we'll go from there.
Well, my prediction is it's based on an if, and that's if Democrats were to gain control in Wisconsin. And my prediction is based on history, because we saw it before in the 1970s and 1980s, and then we undid it in the 1992 redistricting cycle, and that deals with Milwaukee. And what the Democrats did in the 70s and 80s was they intentionally created an artificially low number of majority black districts so that the what I'll call surplus black vote could be widely distributed and splintered over a number of other assembly seats. What that allowed was it resulted in fewer minority representatives, but more Democrats. How do we know we'll do that? Well, 1, they did it before. And 2, we saw what they did in the last remap before the Supreme Court with Dane County, where they came in and had multiple districts come into the city of Madison to pie it out and artificially gerrymander to create more seats. The only reason they didn't do that in Milwaukee was because the Voting Rights Act kept them from doing that. And so I predict that the Democrats gain control, they're going to take aim at the north side of Milwaukee, and the work, the progress that's been made on increased Black and Latino representation in the legislature, which is largely thanks to the Republican efforts that began in 1991, will be unwound.
I don't disagree with that. I think that's a great prediction. I think that's one I would share.
Yeah, I would say that if you look at recent history, we seem to be in a cycle right now where power shifts back and forth between the two parties. And what happens, and one of the reasons that this does occur, is that one of the parties gets power. They say, we're in charge now. We are going to do whatever we do, and we were going to do it as hard as we possibly can. And what happens is they try that, and the voters are repulsed by it, and the other party gets into power. The other party does not learn from what happened to their opponents. They do the same thing, and the first party then returns to power again. If we are looking at a situation, and I guess all the smart people think we are, where the Democrats return to power in 26 in Congress and maybe win the presidency in 28, all indications are that they're going to do the same thing. And so it may well be that even if the Democrats take control of the legislature and hang on to the governorship in 26, when it comes to the redistricting in 2031, we will once again have a Republican governor and a Republican legislature, because Democrats will have completely turned off the voters in those intervening years, because they will not learn the lessons of history.
Amazing. I agree. This is so I appreciate this discussion. This is where I wanted to go. I wanted redistricting to kind of just get into politics, and I think we did that today pretty well. And I appreciate it is politics, exactly. Rick, I appreciate you as always being part of the show, and Joe, thanks for coming back again. Rick, I think before you got on, Joe joked that we could probably do this every couple of weeks, depending on how the
because we didn't get to a bunch of the stuff that you had on.
I know. Well, we're already getting close to time, so we'll have to do this again. And we appreciate to all our listeners, and you know how to get a hold of us. We're at will-law.org/podcast, and then these episodes are available wherever you get your podcasts. So thanks again, guys. Appreciate it.